Welcome to the Jaco Report. I'm Charles Jaco. Dr. Dolly Lucio Severe, a board-certified physician, was given access to a detention center for migrant children in McAllen, Texas, and wrote in her medical declaration, quote, "The conditions within which they are held could be compared to torture facilities," close quote. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calls them concentration camps. A U.S. Justice Department lawyer argued before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that the federal government is not required to provide migrant children soap, toothpaste, or clean clothes. Meanwhile, the Trump administration continues to violate federal law, in this case the Immigration and Nationality Act, by refusing to allow migrants to even apply for asylum. From the treatments of migrants on the border to the so-called Muslim ban, U.S. immigration policy now seems to be clearly racist, at least in many instances. Now, how is all of this affecting the immigrant and refugee community here in St. Louis? Joining us today is Meredith Rata, a therapist who works with immigrants for the St. Francis Community Services in St. Louis. Also from St. Francis Community Service is Martha Pinones, a therapist who specializes in working with immigrant children, and Javad Kazeli is with us, a St. Louis immigration attorney. He wrote an op-ed for the New York Times back in 2017 saying that while he was a terrorism prosecutor in the George W. Bush administration, he was afraid Trump's immigration policies would prevent his family from visiting him here from Iran. Welcome to all of you. I wanted to start with you, since you work with children as a therapist. What are the effects on kids, both short-term and long-term, of being held in facilities like that in these kind of conditions and additionally forcefully separated from your parents? What's that do to kids, and is the damage permanent?
I think you have to realize that these children are already coming from very dangerous homes. So they are seeking asylum and they're already in a state of fear. So what a state of fear causes is the long-term effect would be trauma. But then experiencing more fear, more the separation of your family, losing all of the connections that you have, and then being in a detention center that lacks all of these resources is going to continue that trauma, which leads to something we call complex trauma. So it keeps on kind of adding up, and what that does when you're in a state of trauma for a long period of time, it really just impairs the function of your brain. So these children are now going to not be able to make emotional connections in the brain that a lot of us would typically be able to deal with these matters a little bit faster. It definitely will impair their schooling, their ability to communicate, all of these different areas that are very, very second nature to development and are being stopped by this trauma that they are experiencing.
So the policies of this administration have succeeded, if I understand you correctly, in screwing these kids' lives up permanently.
It's definitely something that can remain permanent, but that's why people like me and like Meredith, who are therapists, try to interject immediately and try to provide support and therapeutic aid at the time that they're able to. Because like any trauma, once you are able to focus in and provide treatment, it can begin to kind of heal those wounds.
Meredith, in terms of the immigrant and the refugee population you guys at St. Francis work with, what's changed in the Trump era? Are people more afraid to even come here? Do they feel in danger while they're here? Has it become harder to represent them legally? What's been the sea change in your on-the-ground experience with immigrants and refugees here?
Yeah, sure. With Spanish-speaking immigrants especially, we did notice a shift around 2 years ago, really around election time, but especially after the election and inauguration. So there is always a level of fear, a baseline level of fear with people who are here undocumented. But that fear escalated quite a bit. And not just fear, but the effects of what they were experiencing in our communities. So we had people coming in, bringing their children in the day after the election, saying that they were already being bullied at school, their children, being told that their parents were illegal and then they needed to go back to their home countries. And these kids were born here and felt already really isolated and disconnected from people that they thought were their friends in their community.
So it's not just governmental policy. It's given a lot of people on the ground freedom to say and act out on what they might have already believed, which is these people aren't real Americans, we don't want them around, and now we can harass them.
That's correct. Yeah, in fact, I had a client in recently just talking about her experience of what is the most difficult thing about being an immigrant right now in St. Louis, she was asked, and she said it is that she understands English, but she doesn't speak English very well, so she hears comments when she's out and about all the time, and she's not able to respond and defend herself, but it's the hatred that she feels that makes her feel unwelcome.
Is that the exception rather than the rule, or is this becoming more and more commonplace in terms of your clients?
You know, that's a great question. I think it just depends. Every immigrant should probably speak for themselves on that. I think a lot of our clients have experienced this, whether frequently or not frequently, depending on who they're interacting with, where they're interacting. I don't want to say that all of St. Louis is not welcoming, because we've definitely experienced the opposite of that, actually. In the past couple years, seeing a lot of people say, hey, wait a minute, we know that these are our neighbors and we want to welcome them. So I think there's an experience of both.
Javon, in your practice, how have things changed since, and your work with immigrants and refugees, how have things changed since Trump got into office and his policies began to be implemented? What's the sea change been there?
I think you've seen two fundamental changes. One of them has been major policy changes with programs that have been around for years that started under Reagan and the first Bush administration. Things that have existed in the legal immigration space disappearing. Temporary protected status has been canceled for almost every country, and this was protection for people from countries that were suffering from the effects of wars or earthquakes that we determine simultaneously right now. The State Department says these countries are too unsafe for Americans to visit, and the Department of Homeland Security is saying these countries are totally fine. We can send people back there. Lots of programs, DACA disappearing, now seeing the immigration courts expediting cases to make it more difficult for us to litigate cases. Some of the discretionary programs totally gone. But you're also seeing a sea change on the administrative bureaucratic side. I was a prosecutor for Immigration and Customs Enforcement for 9 years. Simple things like joint motions to reopen cases when aliens marry U.S. citizens. Those were pretty pro forma, joined by the government. Totally across the board, gone. One of the ones that I think is most shocking just happened in the last day. And it's something that my conservative friends, I think, would just be aghast at. There's a program called Parole in Place, which is a special program that allows for family members of active military members to have a special procedure that's been here for years. This is to help active military families. That program is being shut down in the next 30 days. The assaults across the board.
So if someone is in the military and has family here who are immigrants, they can be deported while this person is serving in the military?
Well, that has always been there. And yes, you know, we've seen a huge increase of that. We've even seen an increase in military members who are out of status, who finished their service and may have committed small crimes, who are being deported. This specific program was one that were for people who would normally have to finish their process overseas. We said, okay, we're gonna let you stay with your family. That program was just announced yesterday that the Trump administration is killing that program.
What is going on here? I mean, the net effect of this would seem to the casual observer to be very clearly racist and with a white nationalist basis to it. But can one implement what are seemingly racist and Islamophobic policies under color of law and not be violating the law? In other words, is this stuff all completely legal, or are they bending the law or ignoring the law or going around the law?
I think you're seeing both. In the case that my mom was involved in, the Muslim ban case that went to the Supreme Court said, you know what, we may not agree with what the president is doing, but we're going to defer to him, which basically legalized the banning of Iranians from America.
You're an Iranian American. You served as a prosecutor with DHS and the W administration, and now your family, your extended family in Iran, is forbidden from coming here and visiting.
Yeah, when my dad was dying, my mom wanted her sister by her side. Her visa was approved. She'd been to the United States several times, always passed background checks. the U.S. government said your visa's approved, come and pick up your visa, and in the 2-day period that it took for her to get there, the president signed the Muslim ban, and all of my family members are banned from coming to America.
Martha, in terms of dealing with your clients, but especially children, you talked about the traumatic effects that this could have long term, but even if the kids aren't traumatized, are they worried because, you know, hey, I'm a brown Spanish-speaking person in Anglo-America and therefore I'm in danger, maybe something that they wouldn't have felt before?
I would say just from my caseload of children, I work with about 25, they do experience a lot of those fears. A lot of them are in the proceedings of asylum, so as we talk about the administration saying, do it the right way, they did it the right way, they're doing it the right way, but still have a huge fear of, I mean, just being in a high school where they are obviously, there's a program that helps them, but also they are then in a group, and then being isolated from everyone else helps them only talk to other teens that are like them. But outside of that, at work or in public transportation or even at their apartments, they do have that fear.
It seems to me from everything you read and from talking to you guys that while these policy changes have taken place and while they may be abhorrent to a lot of people and while they may be clearly racist to a lot of people, there's not really much of anything anyone can do about them right now except triage because the administration is getting away with it. That this seems to be perfectly legal, or the courts are saying, well, if you're fudging the law, we're gonna let you do it. In other words, it is what it is. You disagree?
I mean, the Supreme Court, for the cases that have gotten to the Supreme Court has been fairly hostile to immigrants. There have been a few good cases there, but on the district court level, we've been seeing some pretty big repudiations of the Trump administration. Today, even, the Supreme Court had a decision regarding the immigrant question on the census. And I think if you read it, you could read that the conservatives wanted to rule for the Trump administration, but when the clearly racist documents were finally produced and put in front of them, they had to rule against the Trump administration. So you're seeing a lot of attorneys being a lot more aggressive, and we're getting some good wins. It is exhausting, it is expensive, but there are people out there fighting.
Meredith, what is the impact? Again, you talked briefly about the clients you serve. And yet it seems that the way things are changing is not only in terms of government policy or law, that you've got a lot of people who have come out of the closet as xenophobes, as racist, as people who are hostile to immigrants who might not have said anything before. Do you think the Trump administration's policies have given them the freedom to say, okay, I can really be a bigot and nobody's going to call me on it. I can make life uncomfortable for these people and there aren't going to be any consequences, so why not?
Well, I don't typically speak on behalf of xenophobes, so I mean, it would appear that that is the case. I think because that is the case and because that's what we're seeing, I think it's even more important for places like St. Francis Community Services and other nonprofits in the area to be a safe place where immigrants can walk in and just be themselves and feel welcome and accepted and not have to worry about what does happen on the outside, which is put up with those kinds of attitudes.
Are the number of immigrants and refugees with which you guys deal, has that decreased? Have fewer been allowed in, or have you got a backlog from predating the Trump administration? Has this put the squeeze on people even coming to you?
Right, I think it depends on which group of people you're talking about. Refugee resettlement has dropped drastically, and that is a direct consequence of the administration's policies. What we've seen, though, is an increase of people coming from what we call the Northern Triangle, which is El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. So while we continue to serve the population that we previously served, which is a lot of people that came from Mexico and from Vietnam over many years, we now have a lot of new arrivals who have the same kinds of needs that you would see with refugees.
What's led to the shift from Mexico and Vietnam to Central America?
That's a complicated history. I mean, I think what we can see now is country conditions in the Northern Triangle becoming so dire that people in certain areas in those countries feel that they need to come, and maybe this is maybe one of their last opportunities to find safety.
Javon, you were talking about how there have been some good decisions on the district court level and how lawyers are becoming more and more aggressive. So are we not seeing the complete picture when we see horror stories about kids being abused at the border? Are there some victories that are taking place out there preventing this kind of stuff from happening? Because it seems to the casual observer who does not follow every case moving through the system that the Trump administration is just racking up bodies and is doing what they want to without much of anybody standing in their way.
I think it's a little bit of both. The horrors of the full-on assault on both unlawful immigration and legal immigration is daily. I mean, literally every morning I open up my email to just see what new kind of crazy thing I'm dealing with. There are people out there fighting and getting some wins, but I think overall the situation that we're in right now is dire compared to any time that we've ever had. Even to the point that we saw something in the last 2 days that is unprecedented. You saw the Union of Asylum Officers, nonpartisan officers, file a brief in federal court agreeing with attorneys saying that what the Trump administration is doing to these kids and these families is against the law, it's inhumane, and it basically amounts to torture. I've never heard of, in my 10 years with Homeland Security, that the quiet asylum officers stood up and in unison said something like this in a federal court.
Let me dig a little deeper with that. You spent a decade with, pardon me, Homeland Security. Right now, the mission and the way Homeland Security is behaving seems to have changed drastically. Before, it seemed to be sort of a, domestic bulwark against international terrorism, and now DHS seems to be a tool to essentially get non-white immigrants either out of the country or prevent them from coming in the first place. Having been on the inside of that organization, how shocked are you that that an administration has been able to take the apparatus of a government agency and turn it into that?
I knew things were going to be bad when President Trump was elected. I think to a person, every immigration attorney that I speak to, every former prosecutor, is taken aback by how quickly and how drastically these changes have happened. We're 3 or 4 standard deviations away from anything that we expected. The biggest difference that you can see is under the Obama administration, we had some of the highest removal rates in history, but those were targeted removals aimed at some of our most dangerous people, convicts, felons, gang members. There's a finite amount of resources to go after people like this. The Trump administration got rid of that. Now it seems to be just grab whoever we can. And the people who've been hit the most about that is that there have been large groups of people who've been put on something called an order of supervision. They've been cleared by the government, they have orders of removal, but we've decided these are the best of the best. They'll just check in once a year, but they've never had any criminal background, they've got families here. Instead of going after the gang members and the bad guys, when these poor people are showing up, having done nothing wrong, we're grabbing them and deporting them within 2 weeks and pulling them away from their family. So we've changed our idea. We're not going after the bad hombres, as he said. We're going after the people who show up. It's very different.
Martha, any of the kids you deal with, have they been separated from their parents, or are they all from intact families?
No, so I work with unaccompanied minors, meaning that they did the complete journey by themselves. And then if they were able to connect with family members here in the St. Louis area, we're rejoined with them.
How old are the kids generally? What's the age range?
It honestly depends. I'm sure there are some extremes that say from 2 to 18, but generally from my speaking, it's 13 to 18.
What would motivate a 13-year-old to travel several thousand miles over some pretty hostile terrain by him or herself without their family? How bad are things, or how bad would things have to get for a child to do that?
I think that is what most people don't ever think about. They like to think that these children just one day up and picked up and went on their way instead of really experiencing the culture that are in these countries that they're coming and fleeing from. So a lot of them were persecuted by gang members. A lot of them were experiencing a lot of targets towards their family, towards their particular social group, as we would say in asylum terms. But it's just a fear of not surviving and not making it is really it. That at 13, you're having to worry about how am I going to be able to move forward in this world, and it's not going to be here.
Final question for each of you, and I'm going to start with Meredith. Where do you see things going from here? I mean, Javon had talked about how people were amazed at how quickly things have changed, which is what happens in a lot of autocratic regimes. They're stunned at how quickly the government converts to something else. Where do you see us going from here? Do you think there's some light at the end of the tunnel? Is it the headlights of an oncoming train? Do you think that it is going to get even worse? What do you think? You're on the ground working with these folks. What's your belief?
Yeah, I think first of all, you have to remember it is not just the past 2 years. I mean, this is many administrations worth of cumulative policies that affect immigrants, right, over time and in negative ways. So if you look at it that way, that's actually not a great arc. And also, you see a lot of people coming out of the woodwork to say, this is not okay. Like, and maybe they sat around watching a lot of this happen up until now, and now they finally see these news stories and say, whoa, we got to this point? Okay. And what we're really hoping, and what we're trying to do actually right now, working with our partners in advocacy, is harnessing that energy and saying, you know what? Join us, because it doesn't have to be this way. So I want to say that I have hope that we've got a lot of energy behind changing the way things are now.
Javon, where do you think we go from here? What do you think happens next?
A lot more pessimistic. I think the Trump administration is emboldened by each of these things. You know, you would have thought 2 days ago when you saw a father strapped to his 2-year-old, both drowned and their dead body there, that people would have been shocked. I saw just as many people in tears over that as people saying, that kid deserved it. The Trump administration is going to keep getting bolder and bolder. What we've seen across the board on not just immigration, anything that they've been criticized on, they've doubled down on.
Do you think they've harnessed the deep-seated racism in American society a lot of people didn't believe was actually there?
I think that a lot of times when people are having problems in their lives, it's very, very easy for you to convince them to blame somebody else. And right now, it's brown people from the South. It's all their fault. You name anything, it's their fault. As I think Meredith was saying before, was when you ask about the schools and ask about overt racism, people aren't using racial slurs when they can just yell at somebody, build the wall. You know, when I was in the government, we were all told the term illegals is a slur. We should not use that. It's a derogatory term. I've seen attorneys on Facebook make that comment, and now there's actual guidance by the government that says, no, you're mandated to call them illegal aliens. There is a plan in place that is being executed to dehumanize these people. Unless we all believe that one day Donald Trump and Steve Miller are going to wake up and have changed the types of people that there are, I think that you're not going to see any kind of real change until a new administration is in place. I do think we're seeing people emboldened and out there deciding that they want to fight this, but where's their power?
Martha, working with kids, your job is to essentially take care of the future. So looking into the future, what do you think? Are you pessimistic? Are you optimistic? Do you think things are going to get worse and your job's going to get harder and life's going to get worse for these kids? Do you think something's going to change?
I hope something's going to change. I think I fall in between both of you. So not too pessimistic, but not too optimistic, because I've seen what's happened. And I think the difficult portion is that, people are paying a lot more attention. And I was actually talking to Meredith about this because it's children at the border. But these adults who are also seeking asylum deserve that same empathy, deserve that same feeling of, oh, we need to help you. And I think we have a tendency as a nation to break the immigrant down or break the brown person down until they hit a rock bottom that we say, oh, poor them. And what I try to do through therapy and through helping the kids is empower them so that they don't feel that they have to be at their lowest level to feel the best within society. So, I mean, on an individual level, I hope that I can make an impact with each of the children I work, but on a national level, I hope that we all can step in and help these children.
Thank all of you for being with us. I really appreciate it. Our thanks to Javon Kazieli, Martha Pinones, and Meredith Rada for being with us. And our thanks to you, too. We hope to see you back here next week for another edition of the Jaco Report. See you then.